Please. And right in my face. Maybe a little bit. All right, we ready to go? All right. Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Todd Beckwith. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers out of the Baltimore district. And we're here tonight to talk about this afternoon to talk about the Morgan General Ordnance Depot. So this is what we call a formerly used defense site. It was used back in World War I as an artillery and mortar shell loading plant. They were filling those shells with explosives when in October of 1918, there were a series of explosions that destroyed the plant. You can see in this black and white photo up here in the front, on this slide, there's a picture of the black and white photo is a crater from 1918, and it might be difficult to see here, but that's a man standing on the bottom of the crater. So that gives you a sense of how large at least one of the explosions was. Is an extremely large crater there. So we're planning on doing some what we call a remedial investigation out here. We're doing investigation activities to determine, are there munitions left behind out here or any other soil contamination issues that we need to address further. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to introduce our team, again, I'm Todd Beckwith. I'm out of the Baltimore district, and I managed a contract that we have with Weston Solutions, who's performing the work out in the field for us. And also with the Baltimore district, we have Marty Holmes is here. He's the chief of our ordnance and explosive safety section. And I believe we have on the line David King, who's our geophysicist for this project. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Kane, who's the project manager out of New England, the newly assigned project manager out of New England, who's going to introduce the folks from the New England team.
Yep. So thanks, Todd. So here today, I'm the project manager out of New England District. From the project delivery team that I represent, we have two staff that are here. Shanna Sterling, who's in the audience. She's our public affairs officer. And Mike Narcissi, where's Mike? He was here. He'll be here shortly. I think he went out to look at the site, but he's our ecologist and a biologist for the project. In addition, not here and calling in, we have chemists and human health eco risk assessors that support the project. Thank you.
Okay, and again, our contractor that we've hired to perform the work for us is Weston Solutions. Lane Young is here. You want to introduce your folks?
I'm Lane Young. I'm the project manager. I'm Lane Young, project manager for Weston Solutions. And we also have Brandon Sutter here today. He's a geophysicist with us. He's going to be helping collect the data and process it. And I don't think we have anybody else online at the moment.
All right. And then we also work closely with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And Ralph, you want to introduce yourself? Great. And Scott Vondy from New Jersey DP also works with us on this project. And then we've been working closely with the borough of Sayreville. They've provided a lot of great support to us. They provided us these facilities here today and helped us to disseminate a lot of the information for the project. And of course, we got a lot of folks working back in the office, a lot of different disciplines involved in this project, and support from the other municipalities, Old Bridge and South Amboy. So we've got a large project team with a diverse group of personnel working on the project. Next slide. Okay, here's our agenda. What are we looking for? We're going to talk about, what are the main things we're looking for as part of our investigation. Give a little bit of the site history. Talk about what a remedial investigation is and what our objectives are for that. What does it mean for, a property owner out in this neighborhood? What are we going to do with the information that we collect? And we'll talk about the stakeholder involvement and right of entry agreements. It's important for us. In order for us to do any work out here on a FUDS project, we need to have an access agreement, and that's the right of entry agreement. Then we'll talk about our schedule and open it up for any questions and answers. Although I would say that, we don't want to be the only ones talking up here today. So if you have any questions during the course of this presentation, please just raise your hand and ask the question as we're going. We don't want to wait to the end for all the questions. And that goes for folks online as well. There should be a chat link on the bottom where you can type in any questions that you might have. Next slide. Okay, and we're a government agency, the Corps of Engineers, so we have a lot of acronyms. These are some of the major acronyms that we use in our program. I'm not going to go through all these, and we're going to try not to use all these acronyms as we talk through these slides. But again, if we slip up and use some of these acronyms and you don't know what we're talking about, please raise your hand and ask us, what does that mean? Next slide. So what are we looking for? The main thing we're looking for our investigation is what we call MEC, munitions and explosives of concern. So that's any military munition that may pose an explosive safety risk. For our site out here, what's been found historically out here has mostly been 75 millimeter projectiles and 155 millimeter projectiles. But when the site was operational in 1918, they had additional load lines. They had 8-inch projectiles, 9.2-inch projectiles, and a 3-inch Stokes mortar line and a 240 millimeter Stokes mortar line, or not Stokes mortar line, but a mortar round. So those are our munitions of concern that we're expecting to find out here: 75, 155. 8-inch, 9.2-inch, 3-inch mortars, and 240 millimeter mortars. Yes, sir.
You say 240 millimeter. How big is the biggest shell you are looking for? Some of these shells this big, or are they that big?
Yeah, so when we say a 155 millimeter, the diameter of the round is 155 millimeters, which is about 6 inches. So that's the diameter of the round. I don't know, Marty could probably help me better on what the length of a 155 is going to be. Is that
The length of a 155 or even a 9.2 inch will be about 3 feet long. So, the round will stand about 8 tall.
75.
75 is probably about 16 inches tall, and they're about 3 inches in diameter.
Thanks, Marty. Go back. One more thing to discuss there. So another thing we're looking for in our project is what we call munition constituents. Those are the chemicals that make up the munition. We want to conduct some soil sampling to evaluate whether any of those chemicals, which for our project is really just explosives and primarily trinitrotoluene, is our chemical of concern for this site. So that we could sample soil, sediment, or water to determine have there been releases of those compounds, and is there any risk to the public from any of those type of releases. So that's what we're looking for. MEC and MC are the major components that we're looking for. Formerly used defense site, that's the program that we are running under. It's what we call FUDS. And definition of a FUD site is any property that was owned or leased by the Department of Defense and then was transferred out of Department of Defense control prior to 1986. So this site is a FUD site, and the overall goal of the FUD site is to reduce in a timely and cost-effective manner risk to human health and the environment from past Department of Defense activities. So that's the overall goal of the FUDS program. Our project is performed following the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA law. So that's the legal framework that we conduct our work under. That's also known as the Superfund law. But I do want to point out that this site is not a Superfund site. The Department of Defense, whenever we're doing investigations, is always executing our programs following this law. So we're following the Superfund law, but the site is not a Superfund site. And if you want to find more information on the FUDS program, our headquarters, Army Corps of Engineers website, there's a link here that you can see, or you can just do an internet search for Corps of Engineers FUDS, and I'm sure that'll take you to our headquarters website, and you could find a lot of important information on the FUDS program. There are thousands of FUDS sites across the country that we're working on. Okay, so here's a little more detail on the law that I just talked about, the CERCLA law. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
Question, the shells that you find, what state are they in? Are they deteriorating, or are they whole and just intact? Or do you find some that are like starting to leak and run out and whatever?
Well, we haven't started our investigation out here, but I would say that, for a site where there's munitions that have been in the ground for over 100 years, there's going to be some deterioration of the metal. I don't know, Marty, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, so there was also an explosion. So I would anticipate that we'll find munitions that are broken. We're gonna find some that are whole. We'll probably find empty.
Right.
So
Hey,
we're gonna
Marty?
find, I think, yeah, there's a good picture up there showing that a broken round.
Okay.
But I would imagine we'll find them in all different states.
Okay.
We're not anticipating finding any with any fuses, and the fuses were not installed at this facility.
Okay.
So the shipping plugs were installed and then they were shipped overseas for the,
Oh, so they were in fire or state, they leave this place.
that is correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, so here's a summary of the process that we follow under the CERCLA law or the Superfund law. We are currently in the remedial investigation phase. In the 1990s, the initial, identification of release and site inspection were done. And now we want to do what we call an RI, remedial investigation. And the overall goal of that, we want to define nature and extent of any munitions that might be present, nature and extent of munition constituents, and complete a risk assessment. The CERCLA law and decisions about whether additional remedial actions are needed at a site are all based on the results of the risk assessment. If it's determined that there's unacceptable risk at the site, then we move into the next phase, which is the feasibility study phase, and that's where we all evaluate different alternatives for addressing that problem at the site. We look at different remedial alternatives. After that, we move into the proposed plan phase. That's where we would identify what we think is the preferred alternative for the site. We put that out for public comment, formal public comment. We have another public meeting to talk about the proposed plan, and the public can submit comments. We consider any comments we get on the proposed plan, and then the next step after that is the decision document, or the record of decision, where we document and make the final decision on what is the remedial action for this site. And if there's additional actions needed on that, after that, we move into the remedial design and remedial action phases. So that's the process we follow under CERCLA. It does take some time. There's a lot of documents that need to be produced, but it's deliberative, but that's purposeful. So we make sure that we're making sound, prudent decisions about what type of remedial actions we need to do at a site. Okay, here's some more information on the remedial investigation process. Again, we want to determine nature and extent of munitions and munition constituents. Um, Specific objectives, we want to characterize the munition response site. We want to know what are the type of munitions that are present out in the site? What's the density? How many munitions may be present out there? And what's the distribution? What's the lateral distribution? Horizontally, what's the extent of the mech? And then also vertically, how deep do the munitions go? And then for munition constituents, we want to determine what are the concentrations, if any, of munition constituents in soil or sediment or water. And again, our decisions that we make about remedial actions are based on risk. So we need to complete our risk assessment, and we want to make sure that we have accurate MRS munition response site boundaries for the project.
We got a question here. How long will the process take to ultimately undertake the remedial action?
Well, that will depend on, how long, a number of different factors. There are a lot of sites out there that have been doing studies for, a decade or more. We're not necessarily anticipating that for this project. I'm just saying that we'll do initial investigation, and then we'll do a data gap analysis. Then we may determine that we need to do some more data collection before we can really make a decision about what we need to do on the project. And then, I've seen projects that have gone with multiple phases of that, where we might do that 4 or 5 times, where we're really having a complex issue where we're trying to characterize nature and extent, and it takes a lot of different sampling efforts. So, we can't say for sure exactly when we're going to have a final record decision and when we're going to complete all remedial action out here. It will largely depend on what we find when we do our remedial investigation study work.
The next question is, suppose that I'm in one piece of property here, a person next to me, and I say there's a cluster right on the edge of my property of many ammunition, and the neighbor next door don't want to have it done. Can you force him to say, hey, I want to check that property because it's located right next to mine, and there's been a cluster there right in the proximity of the property line, let's say? What do you do to remedy that situation?
We, the Corps of Engineers, can't force a property owner to give us access to their property. However, I would say if you have knowledge of what might be what we would call an imminent and substantial threat to human health, like if there's, something dangerous sitting on the ground out there, you can call the police, you can call, and there are provisions. It wouldn't be through the Corps of Engineers. It would be through some legal avenue where you'd be able to get access to the property and address that hazard. Right. Okay, this figure is the purple circle here is what we call our MRS, the munition response site. And the way that this was drawn back in the 1990s when we were first doing some studies out here. And this is based on the center point of this circle is where the first explosion occurred back in 1918. And the distance from the center point to the outer edge of the circle, the radius, is 1.25 miles. And that's based on the furthest distance that a munition was found from that first explosion point. So it was decided to draw an MRS boundary with a 1.25 mile radius based on that. So you can see it's a rather large area. It's over 3,000 acres. And it includes not just parts of Sayreville, but also a small part of South Amboy and a part of Old Bridge. You'll see as we go through this presentation, yes, our MRS is this big, but the main focus of our investigation is really down more towards the southeast portion of this MRS, where all the load lines were back during World War I. Next slide. Some of the history, some more of the history on this site. Again, it was an artillery shell loading plant, opened in 1918. They had 7 lines that were up and operational when the first explosion occurred in October of 1918. And then over 3 days, there were a series of severe explosions that essentially destroyed the facility. And they were planning to rebuild. They had hired a salvage contractor who came in and began to clean up the property. They leveled it out and were going to rebuild the property. But then a month later, the armistice was signed and World War I ended. So any plans for rebuilding were scrapped. The site would continue to operate as just a storage depot, a supply depot from that point on up until about 1950. When the property was transferred to developers and municipalities. And since then, there's been a significant amount of development that's occurred in the area where the plant was. Slide. So here are a few of the old photos from that 1918 time period. Bottom center photo is one of the production lines before the explosions occurred. So you can see what that looked like, before the explosions occurred. There's a few of the munitions are sitting on the ground on the bottom left part of that photo. And then the rest of the photos, the other 4 photos are all, the aftermath after the explosions. You can see that one large manor there that was, a mile away from the plant and still suffered some severe damage. You got a shop in one of the nearby towns that they had to put guards out to protect the contents of the shops out there. But a lot of nearby towns had significant damage. We have uprooted trees, some pretty large trees that were just pulled out of their roots and knocked over. And then down in the bottom right corner, you can see a few cars that were damaged by the explosions as well. Okay, so there have been, a significant amount of work that was done out here back in the 1990s. The site was first looked at by the Environmental Protection Agency in 1993. They did a preliminary assessment, and that work confirmed that there were munitions present on the site. Based on that preliminary assessment, the Corps of Engineers was called in to do some further evaluations on the project. And this is a summary of the different activities that they did. First thing they did when they came in was do the archive search report, look at all the history and find out what all the history of the site was. And then they had a couple different actions they were doing. Removal actions. They did a removal action on the Eisenhower School, to a 2-foot clearance on the Eisenhower School as part of that removal action. And then an area just south of the Eisenhower School, a 60-acre parcel where there was a residential development planned, what's called the Lemire property, right? Or the Kaplan property. So there was a 60-acre parcel there that had a planned residential development. And we, the Corps of Engineers, did a clearance on that 60-acre area and found a significant quantity of munitions when we did that, about 5,000 munition items. And then back in the 90s, we also had provided some support on some construction activities, utilities that were done, that were being put in. We cleared those utility lines before they put the utilities in. And another construction support activity, and to my knowledge, the last munition item that was reported as being found in this area was at the Samsell Elementary School in 2007. And they were doing a construction project out there. They found a 155 millimeter projectile and were aware enough to call out the experts to handle it. And it turns out that the artillery shell was empty. There were no explosives in it, but we did send out a construction support crew for the rest of that construction project. And then the final activity we did was what we called an engineering evaluation and cost analysis. And that was an evaluation of the overall MRS. They did a number of different geophysical surveys at a number of different grids, a little bit of digging out in the outer parts of the MRS. And the overall conclusions from that ECA were that we should implement land use controls and do some surface clearance in some areas. But I would say that at that time, those recommendations were not implemented. And I'm not really sure why that was, but that those recommendations were not implemented. Yes, ma'am.
Proximity to like the Eisenhower School, where was the main building that where the explosion happened in this area? Was it, you know, you're saying, I'm visualizing like Sayreville Pool and all. Was the building near Eisenhower? I know.
So Eisenhower's right here.
Okay,
This is the first building that
so,
blew up, and then all these other ones.
so it's kind of like, was that Tesco Drive when we were talking before?
Dusko Drive, yeah, is up this direction.
So that's where the main.
Yeah, Dusko Drive,
Visual on today's streets, you know, I
Yeah.
know it was really all open probably at that time.
yeah, so it was on Dusko Drive, right in between Gillum and Rhoda.
So that's the main building where it was.
That was the first one.
Just to get a proximity, how far. Munitions, right? Thank you, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, and this figure is showing you a summary of all the work that was done in the 1990s. You know, the area in that green polygon there is where that 60-acre removal action was done and where the residential development was conducted. And of course, just north of that is the Eisenhower School where a removal action was done. And some of these the black dots and red dots that are further out in the MRS are locations where some geophysical surveys were done. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lane, our contractor, who's going to talk about all the investigation activities that they're going to be performing. But, you know, this figure here is showing you a summary of, you know, based on all that historical information that I just went through and, you know, the study work that was done in the 1990s, this is the area that we're focusing in on for our investigation. And so Lane's going to go through details exactly on what we plan on doing in these different areas. Any questions? All right.
Can you go
Thanks,
back
Lane.
one slide? Yeah. Awesome. All right, like I said before, my name is Lane Young. I'm the project manager for Weston. We're working, you know, for the Army Corps of Engineers to execute this work we've been talking about. So like Todd said, you can see on this figure, this is where we're focusing our investigation to start with. Again, the blue area around the outside is generally the boundaries of the production line area as part of the former depot. All those stars you see are documented munitions finds in the area. And then the yellow, sort of orange polygons on some of those previous maps, we had identified where the buildings were that exploded and where the craters were located. So those circles are buffers around those crater locations. So as we start investigating, we're going to focus our investigation where those former craters and former buildings were located and where munitions have been found in the past, start there and then expand as needed. So we'll go talk about exactly what those investigations are going to look like in each of these areas. Next slide. All right, real quick before we get into that, just a safety reminder. I know we've heard lots of stories about people finding munitions over the years. And just, if you do come across something, 3 things to remember. We call them the 3 R's of explosive safety: recognize, retreat, and report. So first thing, recognize, just when you may have encountered a munitions item. On one of those previous slides, you saw what those may look like today: rusted, corroded, broken to pieces. So cylindrical object, typically. So if you find something and you're unsure, good rule of thumb is don't mess with it. Retreat. So if you do find something and you have questions about it, don't mess with it. Don't approach it, don't touch it, don't move it, and just carefully leave the area. And then lastly, once you're away, just call 911, let them know what you found and they'll know what to do. It's not the first time this has happened in this area, so they're aware. So I'm going to talk about the project, the actual work we're going to do in the field. We hope to be in the field in June, starting this process, and our project could run till the winter of 2027. So December 2027 is when we have to be done with our work and our reporting. So moving from spring 2025 to the winter 2007, the way we're going to do this, we'll mobilize out. We have a sort of a site project area. We'll have an office trailer and stuff. We'll set that up. We'll have our storage facilities. We'll start with some site preparation. We'll need to come out to all the properties where we're going to do surveys and where we're going to do work with the surveyor and just get the lay of the land and make sure we understand what's happening, get all our equipment on site, put it together. We will be doing some quality control seeding, so we'll get to it a little later, but one way that we make sure that our investigation is progressing as designed is we bury some metallic objects in the ground, usually in the top foot. We mark where those are. We know exactly where they are. So when we're doing our surveys, we better find those QC items. Otherwise, our system's not working correctly. So that's something we have for quality control. So we will go out first before we do any data collection and put those seeds in the ground ahead of time. And again, like I said before, we have a metal mapper in the back. That's one of the geophysical sensors we're going to use. So we have several steps that we have to follow to make sure that everything's working properly. So we only have to come out and do this one time. Once we have all of our site set up, all of our equipment we know is working properly, we'll move on to step 5 here, which is the geophysical surveys. We'll use that piece of equipment in the back, the metal mapper, and potentially another piece of equipment. We have some photos of those later. These are non-intrusive surveys, so think of it like a big lawnmower. We'll push it over your property. It'll collect data from the subsurface, and then we'll take that data and we'll process it in the office, and it should tell us, what is in the subsurface. As Todd mentioned, we'll also be taking some samples. Did you have a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the question is, what was the reason for the proximity of having this Gillespie plant here? Was it because the Hercules, which made gunpowder?
I don't know the answer to that.
They manufactured gunpowder. Hercules Powder Company before that. In fact, their dad was there. And is that why Gillespie built that? You don't know idea, right? To be near the gunpowder that's going to be loaded into these shells? Right. We can get back to that. All right.
No, it's interesting,
Yeah, I just wondered why, they pick Morgan there, they do that,
I mean, I know they needed access to the Atlantic Ocean pretty easily. So they needed to be on the East Coast, but why specifically Morgan, I don't know.
They had access to rail here, they had access to the ocean. So, but then probably that was a factor too,
Yeah.
the local plant.
Yeah. But Hercules, they made the gunpowder.
Logistically, I mean, that would make sense. So, in addition to the geophysical surveys that we're going to be doing to find the munitions and explosives of concern, the MEC that Todd talked about, we'll also be taking soil samples as part of our munitions constituent sampling effort. And again, we'll get into it in a little more detail later, but we're going to start with those soil samples And based on the results of that sampling and anything else we find, you know, that effort could be better defined. Once we're done with collecting our geophysical surveys, and we've identified, you know, these metallic objects in the subsurface, you know, it is our intention to come back and investigate what we're calling targets of interest. Those are those metallic items in the subsurface that these geophysical instruments collect. You know, these geophysical instruments have GPS systems on them, so they can, you know, we can go back and locate exactly where that metallic item is in the ground within, you know, several centimeters typically. So we know exactly where to go to try to figure out what this item might be. You know, depending on what those metallic items are in the ground surface, we'll have to deal with those. If it's a munitions item and there's an explosive hazard, we have some very specific protocols that are followed there. Otherwise, if it's just, you know, determined to be safe metal scrap, you know, we will, you know, recycle or dispose of that separately. Once all that data has been collected, and I think Todd noted, you know, there may be a couple phases of this. So, you know, once we do our initial round of geophysical surveys, get the data back, analyze it, dig on some of these subsurface items, figure out what those are, you know, based on those results, you know, we may have to come back to the drawing board and say, we have to do some additional surveys, you know, here or there based on what we find. So we may circle back after 8, you know, do 5, 6 again, and 7, 8 again. But that totally depends on what we find. Once all that data collection is done, we'll move on to the reporting. I know Todd mentioned the data usability assessment. That's something we'll do throughout the process. And that'll help us figure out when we're done with our data collection. When all that data collection is done, we'll do a final data usability assessment, sort of explain what we did and how we feel about our data. We'll do that risk assessment. That's important for the RI. It helps determine, you know, the future path forward based on what we found, what risk is there to human health and the environment, you know, from these items that we may come across. And then lastly, we'll do an RI report. And, you know, that RI report needs to be wrapped up by December 2027. So that's kind of what we're working with there. So that's just real quick what the process will look like in a little more detail. Todd mentioned this is what we're calling this area within that yellow boundary is we're calling our preliminary high use area, or like I noted before, the focus area of our initial investigation. That's focused around the buildings that exploded, the production load lines, the rail lines, and where they've found the majority of munitions in the past. So that's where we're going to start our efforts. Here's some pictures and some bullet points about the actual geophysical surveys. We'll be collecting 2 sets of survey data. One set will be in what we're considering developed areas, you know, residential areas, green space in commercial areas, and municipal areas like parks and so forth, where there's not a lot of vegetation and there's open area for us to get our sensors. So we'll be collecting data there. Generally in those areas, we'll be working around hardscaping. So any driveways, sidewalks, pools, stuff like that. We're just going to go around that in these areas for our surveys. We're not going to move anything. We're not taking anything apart. We're just sort of surveying open space. The second set we're going to do, you know, in undeveloped areas that are still vegetated. There's not a whole lot of that around here, but in areas that are still vegetated, we are going to go in and do some minimal veg clearing, just so we can get access with our sensors. That way we have 2 sets of data, one from the developed areas where work has been done, soil has been moved, and then another set from these undeveloped areas where some of that soil movement and development, you know, we think that these areas, you know, could potentially higher risk and more closely resemble conditions closer in time period to the explosion. Yes, sir.
The people that are apprehensive about getting this done, well, this doesn't affect me at all, what's going on here. Are they being told that we'll put your property back the way it was, not leave you with a mound of dirt where we just dug the hole Is that they could afford?
We're trying to inform them, we haven't.
Maybe that's one of the apprehensions, is what I'm saying.
No, yeah, no, we've gotten some feedback from the public, so we have sent out right of entries. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. And with those right of entries, we do have some fact sheets and some frequently asked questions that we're mailing out with those to help explain exactly what we're trying to do. But, if anybody has any questions, I would suggest that they reach out. There's contact information provided with those ROEs. We're more than happy to help answer questions.
Thank you.
Yep. Again, we started talking about this. The data is going to be collected in accessible areas within that focus area that we talked about. And then we've also, because of the uncertainty relative to that buffer of that preliminary high use or focus area that we've defined, we drew a sort of a 1,000-foot buffer around that. So we'll also be collecting data within that buffer just to make sure we've got, to evaluate that line. Is that line realistic or do we need to adjust it? Again, we talked about data, so we'll be putting grids up. So again, in the residential commercial property, it's our goal to survey 100% of the property up to an acre. So residential yards and that type of stuff. If they've got a half acre, three-quarter acre yard, anything that we can get access to within that piece of property, we'll try to survey. But in those grids, our grids are limited. There'll be either 100 by 100 foot grids or a subset of something smaller, 50 by 50, depending on how much space we can get into. And so we'll only be doing surveys in those grids. And then again, based on what we find, we can do more grids or less grids. So again, I touched on this when we talked about the flow chart. Once we have done these geophysical surveys and we've identified these metallic objects in the subsurface, we do have the ability with the new technology these days to discriminate some and identify what metallic items more closely match the munitions that we're looking for, the 75 millimeter, the 155 millimeter, the 8-inch, 9.2 inch, and the mortar rounds. They're all in our library for our data, so we can compare the feedback to those to see how closely they resemble that. So again, we will be back out to dig on these items that we've identified underground. So we have qualified UXO technicians, especially trained folks that come out and do dig on these items to help confirm exactly what they are. And then based on what they find, that triggers how we dispose of it. The sensors that we use, based on the size of the items that we're looking for, we can expect to confidently find and identify items in the subsurface down to about 3 or 4 feet. The depth of the munitions here varies. Typically, the items from the explosion that would land, we wouldn't expect them to go too deep into the surface, but there has been a significant amount of earth movement here within the MRS with all of development. There is some marshy areas and some wet areas in as well. So we would expect that items may sink deeper into those wetter soils. So again, most of the items that have been found during those removal action and construction support that we talked about before have been within the first 4 feet. However, they have found some stuff reportedly as deep as 14 feet during some construction support on some sewer line installation. But again, we don't know exactly how the mechanism to get to 14 feet, we're a little unsure on. So can you go back one slide? So again, there's a picture of the metal mapper there in the top right. That's the machine that we have here today. We also have another geophysical sensor. It's called a man portable vector sensor. We call it an MPV. It's a little more portable. It does the same thing. If there are any tighter spaces we need to get into, if we need to get in and around trees and that type of stuff in the vegetated areas, we do have this other option. But the metal mapper, the one that's sort of pushed like a lawnmower, is the primary sensor we're going to use. So addition to the surveys I just talked about that we're going to do on developed property and in undeveloped property where we have to do some veg clearance, There is also two other distinct areas of interest where, based on the evidence that we have, we have reason to believe that there may be munitions in these two specific areas. The first one here is a place we're calling Apache Lake. It's this light blue polygon on the screen up next off on the North Vernston Road, sort of across from On Deck. It's a sort of a wetland area, a wet area, surrounded by two streams. It's a low-lying area. And Todd touched on it quickly before. There has been some cleanup efforts here before. Immediately after the event, there was a salvage contractor hired. And I think there's just anecdotal evidence that items may have been put in that area during the cleanup effort. And it's also undeveloped. It's been undeveloped since 1918. So, anything that could have landed there might still be there. So we're going to go look there. And then we're also going to look down in a portion of Cheesequake Creek. We are going to survey the bottom of the creek. We're going to pull one of these sensors on a floatable sled behind a boat and to search for metallic items in the sediment at the bottom of the creek. And that's sort of adjacent to the former loading dock that was at the depot. So again, potential anecdotal evidence that some stuff might have been placed there during the previous cleanup efforts, or again, if any items, fell there after the initial explosion, they may still be there. And again, that's been relatively undeveloped and undisturbed. Again, the picture there, we're going to use a different piece of technology in these two areas. It's still a geophysical sensor. It's just a little different than the metal mapper. And then again, we are going to investigate any items that we find, in the subsurface. So anything metal that our sensors determine is worth going after, and our data analysis determines is worth going after, we'll go and investigate what those items are, determine what they are in the subsurface. In the creek, we'll have specially trained divers, to go out and investigate those anomalies that are in the sediment. So those are the two sort of other areas that we're going to do some work that are a little different than the rest of it. Yes, sir.
How would you handle the marsh area? Brunswick Creek at the marsh?
Yes, currently we don't have any plan to investigate in the marsh area. Nobody's there. But also, I think we're going to start collecting data here. And if we find, depending on what we find in the creek and during our initial surveys, that is something we could look into. Next slide. So again, we touched on this, and we talked on how this is a phased approach. Once we plan on doing our geophysical surveys between June and November of 2025. So this year, we plan on doing our geophysical surveys to try to collect the data from the subsurface and identify where those metallic items are. If there are metallic items that we find underground, we can discriminate to some level what we think more closely resembles a munitions item and what doesn't. But try to limit where we have to dig. But we will need to go back and dig on these items to identify what they are to help with our study, right? If we have a whole bunch of horseshoes out there, that means something totally different than if we've got, a whole bunch of munitions items. So we need to identify what those are exactly. Again, these are two pictures of some of our UXO technicians digging in somebody's yard for another project. This is all done by hand primarily, especially in these areas. Shovels, the guys dig next to the item and then kind of come in from the side. But again, when we do this, very often there is a safety zone established around the areas. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, my question is, if you find a site that it's unstable, let's say a shell down here that's unstable, will you blow it up there in place? That could be moved.
So if we find something that is unstable and cannot be moved, then we will call 911. And then they will come and they will direct those operations.
Your bomb detector guy wouldn't come in and disarm it?
That's not here. They will not. Not for this specific project. They will not. But if we come across an item that is safe to move, like it's empty, like the one they found at the Samsel school, or if it's a pieces and parts, those items, our guys can move. If it's an item that is safe to move, we will move it and we'll store it in a predetermined location and dispose of it, at a later time. Yes, sir.
You guys find something that's not explosive, not harmless. Historical Society would be interested in putting it on museum. Keep that in mind. Maybe you find it. Just throwing that out there.
Sure. No, understood. Yeah, we'll have to talk through, with the Army Corps folks, but.
We have a little display now.
Yeah.
Hey,
So like I was saying, when we dig on these items, typically there's a safety zone established where people within that safety zone may have to be temporarily displaced. So if you're in your house, it's likely that you'll be asked to leave your house while we do this effort, maybe your neighbors. So, depending on the size of the munition and some other things, that will determine what that safety arc looks like. But oftentimes, and it's likely here, when we're doing this work, we'll need to displace some folks temporarily just for safety reasons. All of that will be coordinated well in advance. We're not going to show up one morning and just start digging and then ask you to leave. It'll all be coordinated well in advance. And again, we talked about it. You found munitions. We've moved to a predetermined demolition location. So we've worked with the municipalities, found a place where everybody's comfortable taking those and getting rid of them if we need to. And the police and the fire and the local town, everybody's tied into that discussion and are aware. And then lastly, when we're done with these areas, we do our best, to save, when we start digging, we try to save that top piece of grass as best we can, put it to the side. As you see here, there's a tarp laying down. So we try to reduce the impacts as much as we can, make the hole as small as we can. But when we're done, we'll restore the area back to where it was. We'll put that seed back, and if we need to, we can put some other grass seed and stuff down. But we don't anticipate any significant ground disturbance, at least in the, in the residential areas. But again, that all depends on the item that we're investigating, how deep it may be and how large it may be. Next question. All right, so here's another map. You'll see the MRS, the munitions response boundary is that purple line. You can see that our focus area is that yellow line that surrounds, like we talked about before, it surrounds the original production lines in those areas, as well as where the explosions took place and where the majority of munitions have been found. You can also see the buffer, which is the darker brown line. It's 1,000 feet outside of the other boundary. And all of the property parcels in purple are the properties that when this map was made, we had requested right of entries. As you can see, we are focusing our right of entry requests and the areas where we want to do our surveys around the historic buildings that blew up and the craters that resulted from those explosions. So that is where we're focusing our primary efforts. And then, like I said before, we'll expand as needed based on those initial results. We've also requested access to some parcels in that buffer area, just to collect data on both sides. We would expect to find less density, in those buffer area parcels, but, it's to be determined. Go ahead and go back one. And again, here you can see the 60-acre Ticker boundary where they did the removal action in the 90s is in the green. Those two turquoise-looking boxes, those are the areas from the ECA that Todd mentioned, the last study that was done where they suggested, some land use controls and maybe a surface clearance being conducted. So those areas are within our focus area because that was a recommendation previously. And then those circle dots, those circles you see on there, the red and black dots, those are some of our preliminary ideas of where we could put some of those grids, right? Some of those grids in the undeveloped areas. So we're hoping to put those there along the parkway in some of the undeveloped areas there. The next slide. Munitions constituent sampling. So again, we will be taking some soil samples as part of this initial effort. The strategy of where we place those is, again, we're trying to find nature and extent. We're trying to find what could be out there. And this is primarily explosives here at this site. So we're trying to find nature and extent. Where are these and how much of it is there? Our initial sampling effort will be surface soil sampling, and that's going to be focused in that 60-acre TICRA area. So that 60-acre area where we know they have found 5,000 plus munitions items. So we know that there is a source there's a potential source of MC in that location. So that's where we're going to start our investigation, in the area where the probability is higher. And then based on those results, we'll determine what other sampling is going to be necessary. Whether that be additional surface soil sampling, subsurface sampling, any sediment or potential surface water or groundwater sampling. So all of that, is to be determined in the future once we get this first set of samples collected. Here's a map of where we'd like to collect those samples. We're still working on right of entry agreements for a couple of these properties. But again, we need to collect samples from green space within this area. We need to be able to find some dirt. And we have focused, during those TICRAs in the 90s, the majority of the munitions or the source for potential munitions constituents were found along the northern and the eastern edge of that, so along Ernston Road and up against the Garden State Parkway. So that is where we'd like to focus our soil samples, where they found the most munitions items. So if there's going to be any contamination, we believe it's most likely to be in these areas. So we'll come in here and take our soil samples, get the results, and then go from there. That's all done by hand. What we do is we take from each one of those, if you go back one slide, from each one of those polygons, decision units. So from each one of these polygons, we'll go in there, we'll get 30 small pieces of soil, the special tool, we'll homogenize those together, and those will be sent to the lab to determine, how much or if there's any explosives in that soil. So again, what does this mean for me, for the residents and people affected by this investigation? So we hope to be on site starting our geophysical surveys in late June. So we do have right of entries that have been executed, and we do have parcels that have been identified as available for that work. So we hope to mobilize out in June and then start collecting those geophysical surveys by the end of June. Like I talked about before, prior to us coming out and doing surveys on people's properties, we will do a property review. We'll document the conditions of the site before we get out there. Like I said, we don't plan to move anything. We're not going to mess with any hardscapes or anything that's existing on the site. So we want to meet with every property owner, get an understanding of their concerns, explain exactly what we'll be doing, and then again we have another subcontractor out there who's going to be documenting the condition of the property before we do the work, just in case something does happen. And then we'll have a land surveyor, just a professional licensed surveyor, come out. All like I noted before, our sensors, they're all GPS capable. So as we're pushing these or pulling these sensors across the ground, and they can geolocate and georeference any of those metallic items in the ground, so we know exactly where they are and where we go back to. So to make sure that we're accurate, for every piece of property, we're going to have a surveyor come out and just put a control point. So where it's just like a nail they put in the ground, maybe one or two of those, so that when our guys show up with their geophysical surveys, they can check in with their geospatial equipment and just make sure that, they're really getting the metrics they need to make sure everything is extremely accurate. That's pretty non-intrusive. Like I said, it's just usually a couple nails that are flush with the ground, and we can take those when we leave. Every property owner, we'll be contacting them well in advance to do this initial property review and have discussions with them, talk about schedule. But we will also confirm the surveyors, we will confirm with property owners 2 weeks prior to coming out to do the surveys, make sure that that date is still good with them. Folks can expect 2 people out on site for these surveys, 2 geophysicists. They'll be operating these sensors that we have pictures of, and collecting that data. So there'll just be 2 people out there for that. The Army Corps is still looking for right of entry agreements. Our investigation is only as good as the data that we can collect. So, you know, we still have some right of entries that are out there. We'll talk a little bit more about exactly what that looks like, but, you know, within our focus area and our study area, the Army Corps is still looking for, you know, willing participants. And work will be done during the day. You know, again, this will all be specific to the property owner and our discussions with that property owner, but, you know, we don't typically work at night. It'll be during daytime, you know, 8 to 5. Yes, sir.
I know there's a lot of variables involved. What's the average time to do a 1 acre lot? Well, you know, just a rough number, how many can you get in a day? Just a rough number.
This is Brandon. He's one of our geophysicists, and he'll be able to give you a better answer.
Yeah, so the undeveloped grids, those are the 100 by 100 grids. Typically be a couple days for that. You know, we're doing vegetation removal. We're not expecting too many obstructions or obstacles. For the residential surveys, a 1 acre parcel will take us the longest. Could be anywhere probably between 2 to 4 days. And then, you know, half acre and below, probably between that, you know, 1 to 2, 1 to 3 range. So there's a lot of variability. You know, if you have a nice big open half acre, 3/4, you know, we'll blow through that. If you have a property that has a bunch of different small little portions of areas that accumulates it, you know, it takes us longer to go around and get around. So there's variability, but generally, you know, it's multiple phases, and each phase will just be a couple of days.
And I didn't really touch on it, but there'll be 2 phases of this geophysical investigation too. We'll come through first time with the metal mapper or the MPV, and we'll collect the data, pushing it sort of like you mow your lawn, and that collects the data. And then that data is going to be processed, and then we'll come back and we do another survey that collects more detailed data. I'm going to defer to Brandon again here, but for that effort, we just take the sensor, we put it over that location that was previously identified, and we leave it there for like 60 seconds or so, get better data, and then from that's primarily what we use to do some of that discrimination that we talked about.
Yeah, that's generally correct. Yeah, the first set of surveys is just covering as much space as we can in much area, and then we'll identify specific anomalies that we'd like to go further investigate. And then we just navigate to those specific locations and just collect stationary data. And that allows us to do our kind of classification, discrimination of, you know, what may be worth intrusively investigating and what would be.
Yes, sir.
If you find something, do you have a parameter defined how big an area is going to look this time? If you find something on the edge of where you work, do you expand that boundary, or are you?
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's where we talk about those phases, right? So if we're at the northern end of that, what we're calling our focus area, or we're in our buffer area, and we're just coming across significant amount of mech, you know, or pieces of munitions debris, large hunks of it, then we will definitely go back to the drawing board and see if we need to, you know, do some. We have options in that, the way that works. Yeah. So, you know, we'll.
Stop right here, whatever's on the other side of the fork, I'll put it around.
No, we call them step out investigations. So, you know, we'll get to the end of our initial boundary, and then if there's something along that boundary, we'll do these quote step out investigations to define what that is. Because we don't want to. Yep. Next slide. So again, what will we do with this collected information? We've talked about a lot of this already. We're going to be doing a data gap analysis and data usability assessment. So again, that is once we collect all this data, if we see you know, we have this big cluster of properties where we're finding a whole bunch, we need to go back there and do some more work. And that type of stuff. So we'll be doing that throughout the process and, you know, defining, you know, where we have data gaps and what those mean for the project. This data gap collection, that's some of those step outs that we talked about. So anything that we find that we think is questionable or warrants further investigation, then we do have that ability to do these data gap collection efforts. Again, we'll write this RI report, you know, eventually that will become public information. We have an admin record that's set up at the Sayreville Public Library. So all of our project documents, when they're done, are gonna go there. And again, that's gonna go through a pretty rigorous review process. The state of New Jersey is gonna be involved in that. And then this risk assessment, it's gonna be rolled into the actual report, but it is a very important part of the RI. That's sort of where we look at the results of both the munitions that we find and evaluate, you know, what is the risk, the explosive risk at the site based on what we find and the receptors and, you know, how the property is being used and that type of stuff. So, and then again, we'll look at the chemical data that we get back from our sampling as well. And we have risk assessors that, you know, will run through that human health risk assessment as well related to those chemical constituents. And all of that will be, all of that risk assessment work will be rolled into the RI report. And that'll help determine what the next steps are, right? Like what Todd outlined before, you know, do we need to continue with those further steps to get to, you know, a final decision and any cleanup that is needed. Next slide. So stakeholder involvement, again, we've touched on this before, you know, New Jersey DEP is involved. They review our project documents, they do oversight. They comment on, you know, our scope and our methods. So they're involved in the process. Local leaders and representatives. So, you know, Sayreville has been very generous. They've helped us out a lot with our time space. They're quite involved and supportive of the investigation. You know, and they're part of stakeholders. We're doing some work on Sayreville property. And we've also have some right of entry agreements with South Amboy as well on some of their properties. You know, all of the documents we produce will be available to those folks. All of the public documents, not everything should be public at the end. Maybe not draft as much, but as we go through the process, the final documents that we produce will be made available. And of course, the local community, right? We need all of your support for this. You know, we're asking right of entries to get on your property to do this work. Like I talked about before, you know, there might be some temporary displacements that are needed. So we just, you know, ask the public to work with us on that. We'll be as flexible as we can. But we do, you know, we'll need to get some help from the public just to get this work done. Oh, and last thing about public, you know, if you have any information, you know, we're still trying to define the boundaries of our work, where we're going to collect data, where we're not going to collect data. So if there's information folks have about, you know, where items have been found or anything like that, you know, I think we're open to just hearing about all that as well. Here's a little bit about the right of entry process. So we identified properties that we wanted to do work on, wanted to investigate based on the data we had. So based on the historical data, based on the known munitions finds, based on the location of the depot, based on, you know, where the buildings were that blew up, we focused our initial right of entry requests on those properties. So in that sort of focus area. So we worked with the Army Corps to identify those parcels, and the Army Corps sent out a letter with an agreement to all of those property owners. If you think back, there were all those purple polygons identified on that one map. Since then, we've sent out a few more. So as of today, give or take a few numbers here, we have requested access to a total of 229 parcels. Those are owned by 157 property owners. So like I said, Sayreville has been quite generous. So, you know, Sayreville owns numerous parcels in that 229, but we have contacted 157 property owners to try to get access. Again, most of those are on, private property. There was 159 parcels have been requested from 153 private landowners. So there are some folks who own more than one property that we requested access to. When this slide was put together a couple days ago, we had agreements for 19 of those, quote, privately owned parcels. We have denials for 20 parcels. So 20 people have said no, 19 people have said yes. And then we're still waiting on responses from 120 people. We've done some canvassing efforts. We've walked around the neighborhood of Sayre Woods off Ernston Road, left some packages, information packets and some stuff there, trying to talk with folks, try to get responses for those remaining 120 parcels. And then, like I noted before, public property, we have requested access to 70 parcels. Most of those are from the borough of Sayreville, and we have 7 agreements executed for 68 parcels. We're not going to do surveys on all of those. Our survey design has changed a couple times since we first started this. But we will be definitely doing surveys on, a couple public parks and some open space owned by Sayreville. Oh, and by the New Jersey Turnpike. So we'll be doing some work up along the Parkway, and we needed a right of entry and a permit from the state to do that. We got that executed. So all that being said, we're trying to get the word out. We're trying to, let people know what we're doing. Again, like how this could potentially affect all of you. We want to hear about your concerns. So we have these poster sessions and meetings today. We have 2 of them scheduled today. This is the first one. We have another one this evening. We have a web page the Army Corps has a web page. This is the link here. You can also use that QR code. You can take a picture of it, hold your phone up, it pops up a link. You can go right there, and it has some fact sheets. It has meetings from our last, meeting that we had with the town and regulators, has some slides on there and some other information. So there's more information about the project online. You can get there through that website or that QR code. Like I noted before, we have an administrative record. The way that works is the RI phase, the phase that we're currently in and the part of that circular process. This is the first phase where documents get put in that admin record. The first document that's going to be put in there is our work plan. So we're hoping to get that finalized here very shortly. Once that gets finalized, that work plan will go in the library, and then our other final documents, as they're produced, will be put there as well. And then here, Chris is the primary POC for this. He's the project manager at the New England district. That's his information, his email, his office and phone number. So any questions related to anything, you can definitely reach out to Chris and he'll reach out to the right folks.
These pictures available that you showed us the different buildings and everything there?
Yeah, no, we have copies of those pictures. They're available. Yeah.
To the website?
They're not all on the website, but there's something we can think about. We can put up, just some.
Yeah, the things in the town.
Yeah.
Buildings and all stuff, they're not available right now.
They're not available right now on the website. We have the fact sheet, and I know the fact sheet includes this picture, but most of the pictures are not on the website right now.
Pictures to a lot of people, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I think we can talk to public affairs about putting some photos up on the website. This lady, Chandra. Yes, sir.
The entire the efforts that we put forth in all the mapping, identification of areas of concern. Let's see, can we, the town restrict, property changes in your map areas of concern? In other words, if somebody, you've identified a lot that you're suspicious of, and somebody comes into borough and says, I want a building permit, I want to put a house up there on this empty lot. Is there a way or a method by which, or should we be restricting and saying, no, you don't get a building permit or modifications to that property until it's checked by the Corps of Engineers or some, your agency or somebody?
So I'll defer to Todd, but it's my understanding that the Army Corps of Engineers does not have the ability, but land use controls is one remedy that can be selected as part of that process. But, and there are things I believe that the towns can do to put on properties in terms of transfers and that type of stuff.
Yeah, so the town can't enforce land covenants or deed restrictions. The government can't do that. The only thing we can do is advise in our reports that there's land use controls required for the property, either limitations on excavation depths or, we prepare maps showing the areas where we think there could be more items. And then it's really up to the town on what they do with that information. But we would be required to maintain land use controls and report on progress every 5 years, even after the remedy is complete on some of these areas.
So the Army's not going away.
Is there presently a method of communication, let's say, between code enforcement or building department municipally and the Corps? So that municipally, somebody in this building looks at a map and says, oh, they want to put up an apartment house here. We better notify the Army. And, that they're applying for a permit. This whole section of Middlesex, Monmouth County is under tremendous pressure for building and development right now. And I see buildings going up in areas that, growing up in the area, I never thought they'd be building in that area, but they're building now. There's a lot of pressure. And I'm wondering if you've done such an outstanding job of identifying parcels of area of concern. Is there a communication back and forth between the Corps and code enforcement or municipal authorities?
I don't know if there's been anything done to date between the town and the Corps. I'm guessing not, because we haven't concluded our investigation and we can't, we don't yet have the data. We just have the historical information.
Yeah, but you've identified parcels that are of concern.
Right.
I'm thinking, let somebody walk your machine over the property for a day or two before the bulldozers come in, and then give them the permit, and say, yeah, go ahead and build. And not wait until a bulldozer turns up with something that might go boom.
You mean like the area behind Harbor Club where they put that whole complex there? That's right here in Morgan.
Yeah.
Yeah, they built the Harbor Club, and then after that, a couple of years ago, they put up a big area right behind it. Yeah, right, over by the park, I should say, that was big, and I guess nothing happened, they just built it.
Yeah. I'm looking for some method of communication between what you're identifying and the authorization from the municipality that you go ahead and build.
Because they're all.
Especially when it's in the proximity of where the Gillespie
Oh, he's
was.
already identified the property,
Yeah,
we think there might be, there's probably a problem here.
yeah, because.
Let's check it
next to
before we
Gillespie.
dig.
And there are a lot of contractors that have been coming in, putting up all these homes. What I think the man is trying to say is, if they come across something while they're digging, are they going to notify anybody?
Which is very.
Or are they just gonna bury it?
So
Or, you know what I mean?
Stop building, because now all of a sudden the contractor says,
Yeah, we ain't gonna halt, here, there's no way.
Yeah,
we're not
or,
gonna,
or do they not really know what they just dug up, or is it a piece of pipe to them or something to that effect? That's what I think the man is trying to say. A lot of contractors have been coming into the area building.
So I know for a lot of projects like this, I don't believe there's any current interaction between our suspicions and the municipal decision makers, right? I don't believe there's any of that currently ongoing. And like we noted before, the Army is not allowed to enforce anything.
Correct.
So as we move through this process, one of the things that is most likely gonna be recommended is gonna be something called educational awareness, I believe is what they call it. So there will be an effort by the Army to make the community more aware of these hazards, right? So that people coming in are just straight up aware. But then, anything beyond that is really gonna be up to the local municipalities to how they want to try to enforce that or roll this information into any of their requirements.
So-
So I would say that, you know, typically we'd be looking at that later on down the road, and we're trying to come up with what I call the record of decision, our decision document, where we think our final remedy. But, you know, it's certainly something that we can discuss, you know, with the town. I don't know, you know, they have any mechanisms where they can see that or not. And again, it's outside their control. So, you know,
I mean,
willing to have the
you guys turn around and say, hey, look, we had this whole series of public meetings and all these nice posters and handouts and everything else. For, what do we have, like 8 people here from the public, and anybody, Sayreville employee or South Amboy employee who from code enforcement or any, you know, anything like that. That's the level of communication I'm looking for. Is how does the municipality officially, dig into this matter?
Yeah.
So to speak?
Yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that. I do know that Glenn Skarzinski here in the borough of Sayreville is aware of what we're doing and aware of all this stuff.
That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, no, he was here.
Even awareness, I think you know,
Yeah, so.
more than what we've seen.
Yeah, so they were involved in our, we were here in February to have our initial discussions with the state of New Jersey. Not our initial, but one of our rounds of discussions with the state of New Jersey and Sayreville, and they were all in on that, and they were all involved in that discussion, yeah.
And we can coordinate any discussions that involve the town to answer your question directly, you know, but right now, nothing to my knowledge exists. But we can get with the town to, you know, determine what will be disseminated once the reporting is finalized by the government.
Yes, sir.
So when it comes to right of entry, get more yeses. Is private property, have you ever thought about incentivizing participation?
In what way?
Giving you a card. Exchange.
That's a government question.
We can't do that.
Yes, sir.
He's picking up something that I'm concerned about. I've got 3 building lots. And I'm not gonna go along with the right of entry. I'm gonna say no to it. That's not gonna, at this time, that's not gonna affect anything. I don't wanna be in the middle of a project and finding out just what he's saying right now. And stop my project, because we really have, I mean, in the outside 1,000 foot, I'm not even in the concern zone, and the only reason we're requesting it is because everything else is built up there. And I have an empty property. I don't wanna be sitting down there on saying, well, you know, you deny us access, so we're gonna stop you from, building a home?
There is nothing currently in place that would stop that I know of at this time.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, we have no way of doing that.
Because if everything else is built up all the way around, you're gonna pick on one guy in a minute. Because we develop this property, you know.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's something that's imminent, that is a concern. Maybe, do we have one more slide or 2 more slides here?
Say, just keep in mind, that they're willing to do this free of charge now, that you're saying they're not gonna allow them access to potentially clear your property of emissions free of charge, so then if once the project's done, they may not come back, and that's the, like, ultimately your responsibility, so that's something you should consider or keep in mind when they're making that decision.
Yeah, I mean, that part I'm not worried about. Okay.
So our schedule, again, like I noted before, our geophysical surveys would have been that open space, undeveloped areas, people's yards, commercial properties with green space, and those grids in the undeveloped areas. We're hoping, it's our plan to collect that data, do those surveys between June and November of this year. We're looking to do Apache Lake, to do our data collection in Apache Lake off of Ernston Road there, sometime in September. We're looking for maybe a little bit drier time when there's a little less water in there to get in there and do our work. Cheesequake Creek, we have on the schedule to do the initial data collection, the surveys with our boat, pulling behind the floating sensor in September of this year. This target of interest investigation, that's when we go back and actually, try to dig up these metallic items to see what they are. We like to do work in the water. We like to do our intrusive investigation soon after we collect the data, just because it's a dynamic environment, things are moving. And like I said, we'd hate to have a GPS point A and then come back a year later and nothing be there because it got moved. So we're depending on a couple of documents that need to get through the approval process. We're hoping to be out there in October with our divers, investigating those targets in the sediment, the month after we collect the data. We'll have to collect the data, process it, get it approved, but then that shouldn't be a problem. But, October, November of next year, be out there. That'll be the first time that any of these potential movement of people, temporary displacement might occur. That shouldn't affect too many people up in the general Sayreville area, but we'll have to work closely with the marinas and the boat traffic down there when we get to that point. Our intrusive investigations are digging in the open space and the grids on people's properties, again, where this temporary displacement might have to occur in like the neighborhoods. That'll be in 2026. So once the ground thaws in about March, we'll hopefully be back out here digging on some of these items that we've identified with these sensors. And again, depending on right of entries and what we find, that could take us through November of 2026. We also, this is out of, and then a year later, we'd like to come back and do the intrusive work at Apache Lake, but that's relatively flexible. And then that leaves us the whole month of, the whole year of 2027 for our reporting process, which can take a while just to get the report written, all our data put together, and then run through the review cycles with the Army and the state and the town and everything. Next slide. So again, just a couple more things just about, again, there is a project webpage. I can go back to that QR code. It's also back on a couple of those documents. That has some information there. And then this 3R's explosive safety. So the Department of Defense has a safety education program. You'll see back there, we have some bookmarks that we printed out and laminated. That's where we got those. And that's the type of stuff that you would see as part of an educational awareness program, if that was implemented, in Sayreville. But that's free to the public. Anybody can get that now. So in reality, if the town wanted to print some of those out, flyers out and put them up, that's their decision. And again, if you ever are out there and you come across something, just remember the 3Rs: recognize, retreat, and report. You find something that looks like it might be dangerous, recognize it for what it is, especially in this area. Now that you know it's a problem or a potential problem, don't touch it, don't move it. These things can be relatively sensitive. So you just don't want to take any chances there. And then once you're away, just call 911. Like I said, they know exactly what to do. They've done it here before. All right, and that's all we had today. So any other questions?
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Dean Curran.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming. No, questions are good.
I understand what you said, but behind any favor, put up